April 11, 1945. Buchenwald concentration camp, Weimar, Germany. Captain Marcus Holloway of the 6th Armored Division, 3rd Army, stood at the main gate of Buchenwald concentration camp at 1520 hours on April 11, 1945, and understood immediately that everything the army had taught him about war was insufficient preparation for what lay beyond those iron bars. The gate itself told a story before he entered. Jedem das Sein, to each what he deserves, wrought in iron letters visible from inside the camp, a message prisoners saw every day as they marched to labor details. The 6th Armored had been pushing east from the Rhine for weeks, encountering sporadic Wehrmacht resistance that collapsed quickly under American firepower. Their mission was pursuit and exploitation, maintaining pressure on German forces retreating toward Bavaria. Nobody had briefed them on concentration camps. Intelligence had mentioned prisoner of war facilities in the area, but nothing in Holloway's training covered what he was about to witness. The camp had been partially liberated by its own prisoners hours before American arrival. Communist political prisoners, organized into underground resistance cells over years of captivity, had seized control of watchtowers and guard posts when SS personnel began evacuating on April 10. By the time Holloway's tanks reached the perimeter, approximately 21,000 prisoners remained alive inside Buchenwald, though alive proved an inadequate word for their condition. Holloway had graduated from West Point in 1940, commissioned into armored forces just as the army began building its mechanized divisions for the war everyone knew was coming. He had landed at Normandy on June 8, fought through the hedgerows, survived the Bulge, crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim. He had seen combat deaths, civilian casualties, destroyed towns, refugees on frozen roads. He believed he understood the cost of war. He was wrong. The first thing that struck him was the smell. Technical Sergeant Robert Chen, Holloway's platoon sergeant and a former medical student from San Francisco, would later describe it in his diary as the odor of death concentrated beyond anything the living should experience. Bodies lay stacked near the crematorium, too many for the camp's disposal capacity in its final weeks. Other bodies remained where prisoners had fallen, too weak to reach shelter. The April weather had been warm enough to accelerate decomposition. The second thing was the silence. Holloway had expected chaos, perhaps celebration at liberation. Instead, most prisoners who could move simply stared at the American soldiers with expressions that contained no recognizable emotion. Not relief, not joy, not even curiosity. Just emptiness. Years of systematic dehumanization had stripped them of the capacity for immediate emotional response to their liberation. Private First Class David Sullivan, a farm boy from Nebraska who had never seen poverty worse than Depression-era rural America, vomited twice in the first 15 minutes inside the camp. Holloway did not reprimand him. Half the platoon was fighting the same reaction. Corporal James Washington, an African-American soldier from Alabama who had experienced segregation and racial violence in the Jim Crow South, walked through the barracks examining bunks where 6 prisoners had been forced to share sleeping platforms built for 2, and said only, "I thought I knew what hate could do to people." Holloway's orders from division were simple: secure the camp, provide immediate medical assistance where possible, and document conditions for war crimes investigators. The execution of these orders proved anything but simple. Medical supplies brought by the advance units were designed for combat trauma, not mass starvation and typhus. The division's medical officer, Major Samuel Rothstein, arrived within 2 hours and immediately established triage protocols, but the scale overwhelmed available resources. Rothstein estimated 500 prisoners required immediate hospitalization to survive beyond the next 48 hours. The division had field hospital capacity for 200. The documentary photography requirement became its own ethical crisis. Signal Corps photographers attached to the division began systematic documentation of conditions, but their presence disturbed what remained of prisoner dignity. Lieutenant Thomas Bradford, a signals officer from Boston, found himself photographing skeletal corpses stacked like cordwood near the crematorium and asking himself whether this documentation served justice or whether it simply compounded the violation these people had endured. He photographed anyway, understanding that future generations would need evidence to believe such places had existed. Holloway established his command post in the former SS administrative building, a clean, well-appointed structure that stood in obscene contrast to the prisoner barracks visible through its windows. He found records there, meticulously maintained documentation of prisoner numbers, transport lists, execution orders, work assignments. The bureaucratic precision of systematic murder reduced to accounting ledgers. He also found personal effects confiscated from prisoners upon arrival. Wedding rings, family photographs, identity papers, eyeglasses. Thousands of individual lives reduced to sorted piles of objects. By 1800 hours on April 11, Division Command had established contact with SHEF headquarters, and General Eisenhower's staff began coordinating massive medical and supply resources toward Buchenwald. But the immediate crisis remained. 21,000 people who needed food, water, medical care, and shelter, and an American military unit equipped and trained to fight tanks, not to manage humanitarian catastrophe. Holloway made his first command decision at 1830 hours. He ordered his soldiers to begin distributing their own rations to prisoners, despite regulations prohibiting such use of military supplies. Technical Sergeant Chen warned that sudden rich food intake could kill starvation victims, but the alternative was watching people die while waiting for appropriate medical supplies to arrive. They distributed small portions, enforced slow consumption, and watched helplessly as some prisoners ate too quickly anyway and died from refeeding syndrome within hours of liberation. The second command decision came at 2000 hours when Holloway discovered that several dozen SS guards had been captured by prisoners before American arrival and were being held in a makeshift detention area inside the camp. Some showed signs of severe beating. 3 were dead, killed by prisoners in the hours between SS evacuation and American arrival. The survivors expected execution or at minimum, transfer to prisoner custody where vengeance would finish what the beatings had started. International law was clear. Captured combatants received protection under Geneva Convention provisions regardless of their previous conduct. War crimes would be adjudicated through proper legal channels. Summary execution constituted murder under military law. But Holloway stood in a camp where these same SS guards had participated in systematic torture and murder, and the survivors of that torture were asking him, through interpreters, why he was protecting the guards. A Polish political prisoner named Stefan Kowalski, who spoke fluent German and broken English, served as informal liaison between prisoners and American forces. Kowalski had survived Buchenwald since 1940, 5 years of starvation, forced labor, and watching friends die. He approached Holloway at the SS detention area and asked a simple question: "You will protect them, these men who burn children in ovens?" Holloway gave a simple answer: "Yes. Because if we execute prisoners, we become them." Kowalski considered this, then replied, "You are correct. But you do not understand what it costs us to accept your correctness." Holloway did not claim to understand. He assigned a guard detail to the SS prisoners with orders to prevent both escape and vigilante justice. Private Sullivan, who had vomited twice earlier, volunteered for this guard duty. Holloway asked him why. Sullivan said, "Because I'm angry enough to want to kill them myself, sir, which means I need to prove to myself I won't." The night of April 11 passed in organized chaos. Medical personnel worked through darkness treating critical cases. Army engineers established water purification systems to prevent disease spread. Military police cordoned the camp to prevent prisoner exodus before medical screening could identify typhus carriers. And Holloway walked through barracks trying to understand what he was responsible for now that combat had delivered him here. He encountered a French Catholic priest named Father Michel Dubois who had been in prison since 1943 for hiding Jewish families. Father Dubois spoke English learned from missionary work in Canada before the war. He asked Holloway whether the Americans would stay long enough to see proper burials for the dead. Holloway promised they would. Father Dubois asked whether burial would be Christian for Catholics, Jewish for Jews, secular for atheists and communists. Holloway had not considered this. He promised to make arrangements. At 0200 hours on April 12, Holloway received radio communication from division headquarters. General Eisenhower was ordering all available units in the region to witness concentration camp conditions firsthand. Every soldier in 3rd Army would, if operationally possible, visit Buchenwald or similar camps being discovered across the theater. The Supreme Commander wanted his forces to understand what they had been fighting against, wanted them to see firsthand the necessity of complete victory over Nazi Germany. Holloway understood the strategic wisdom of this order. He also understood it would traumatize thousands of soldiers who might have finished the war without witnessing industrialized death. But he acknowledged that bearing witness was itself a form of duty. If these prisoners had survived to testify, then American soldiers could survive to understand their testimony. April 12 brought 3 developments that forced Holloway to confront the gap between military procedure and moral necessity. First, several dozen prisoners died despite medical intervention. Refeeding syndrome, typhus complications, organ failure from prolonged starvation. Dr. Rothstein explained that they had been too close to death when liberated, their bodies too damaged to recover even with proper care. Holloway watched soldiers who had survived Normandy and the Bulge break down crying at their inability to save people they had arrived to rescue. Second, civilian residents of Weimar, the nearby town, began claiming ignorance of camp conditions. American military government officers brought groups of German civilians to Buchenwald, forced them to tour the grounds and witness the evidence. Most expressed shock. Some claimed they had believed the camp held only political criminals receiving justified punishment. One elderly woman fainted at the sight of corpses near the crematorium. Holloway felt no sympathy. The camp sat 3 miles from Weimar. Its chimneys had been visible for years. Forced labor details had marched through town streets. Ignorance had been voluntary. Third, tensions developed between different prisoner groups. Political prisoners, mostly communists who had organized the underground resistance that seized control before American arrival, attempted to establish leadership authority. Jewish prisoners, who had suffered specific genocidal targeting, resisted this political organizing. Soviet prisoners wanted immediate repatriation. Western European prisoners feared Soviet repatriation would mean deportation to Siberia for perceived collaboration. Holloway found himself mediating disputes between victims of the same system who now disagreed on how to proceed with liberation. Stefan Kowalski explained the tension to Holloway on April 13. The political prisoners had maintained organization and resistance throughout captivity. They had sabotaged production, smuggled information, protected weaker prisoners when possible. They believed their political consciousness had enabled survival. Jewish prisoners, Kowalski said, had been murdered so systematically that survival resulted from luck more than resistance. The political prisoners wanted credit for liberating the camp. Jewish survivors wanted recognition that they had been targeted for annihilation simply for existing. Both groups were correct. Both groups were traumatized. And Holloway, a 27-year-old Army captain from Minnesota, was somehow expected to facilitate reconciliation. He did what he could, which meant implementing military order without imposing military hierarchy. He established prisoner committees representing different groups, guaranteed equal food and medical access, and made clear that American military authority was temporary. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force would coordinate long-term displaced persons management. Until then, his job was security and basic welfare. By April 15, large-scale relief operations had reached Buchenwald. Medical personnel from across 3rd Army, supplemented by Red Cross volunteers and British medical units, established proper field hospitals. Supply units delivered appropriate food for starvation victims. Military government officials began processing prisoners for repatriation or resettlement. The immediate survival crisis passed. Holloway received orders on April 16 to rejoin his division, which had continued advancing east. The 6th Armored was approaching Czechoslovakia, chasing Wehrmacht units that still offered sporadic resistance. The war continued, even as evidence of its moral necessity lay stacked in mass graves behind him. Before departing, Holloway attended a memorial service organized by prisoners for their dead. Father Du Bois led Catholic prayers. A Polish rabbi named Emanuel Stern, who had somehow maintained his faith through 3 years at Buchenwald, recited Kaddish for Jewish dead. Communist prisoners sang the Internationale. American soldiers stood at attention throughout, understanding they were witnessing something beyond military protocol. Stefan Kowalski approached Holloway after the service and presented him with a small metal tag stamped with a number, 38,492. Kowalski's prisoner identification. He said Holloway should keep it as a reminder that the number had represented a human being who survived to tell his story. Holloway accepted the tag and carried it in his uniform pocket for the remainder of the war and for decades after. Technical Sergeant Chen asked Holloway, as they drove away from Buchenwald on April 17, whether anything they had done there mattered. The division had liberated a camp where prisoners had already seized control. They had provided medical care that saved perhaps 1,000 lives while 500 others died anyway. They had protected SS guards who deserved execution. They had documented atrocities that seemed beyond documentation. Had any of it made a meaningful difference? Holloway said yes, but he understood Chen's doubt. The scale of what had happened at Buchenwald, what had happened across dozens of similar camps, exceeded individual human capacity for response. You could not save everyone. You could not adequately punish the guilty. You could not restore what had been destroyed. All you could do was bear witness, provide what help remained possible, and ensure the evidence survived for judgment and memory. The 6th Armored Division continued east. They fought scattered engagements with Wehrmacht rear guards, liberated additional towns, accepted surrenders from German units that recognized the war was lost. Victory in Europe came on May 8, 1945. Holloway was in Czechoslovakia when the announcement came, and he felt none of the celebration he had expected. The war was over, which meant the killing would stop, but it did not mean recovery from what the war had revealed. After VE Day, Holloway served in occupation duty in Bavaria, managing displaced persons camps and processing German prisoners of war. The work involved daily confrontation with the aftermath of Nazi Germany's collapse. Former SS members claiming they had only followed orders. Civilians insisting they had known nothing. Concentration camp survivors struggling to rebuild lives from nothing. And American soldiers trying to administer justice while maintaining the distinction between victor and conqueror. Holloway returned to the United States in December 1945, separated from service as a major. He attended the Nuremberg trials as an observer in 1946, watching as documentary evidence from Buchenwald and other camps was presented in a courtroom where legal procedure attempted to address systematic mass murder. The defendants seemed ordinary, bureaucratic men who spoke of following orders and cited military necessity. Holloway wondered how such ordinary people had participated in such extraordinary evil, then recognized that this ordinariness was precisely what had made the system function. He carried Stefan Kowalski's identification tag in his pocket throughout the trials. He never returned it. Kowalski had emigrated to Australia after the war, rebuilt his life there, and died in 1968. His family located Holloway in 1970 through veterans organizations and asked whether he remembered their father. Holloway sent them the identification tag along with a letter describing their father's dignity under impossible circumstances. They wrote back thanking him for preserving evidence that their father had existed as a human being, not merely as a number in the Nazi system. Marcus Holloway lived until 2003, dying at age 85 in Minneapolis. He rarely spoke about Buchenwald publicly, but he spoke about it extensively with his grandchildren. He wanted them to understand that evil could be systematic, bureaucratic, and ordinary in appearance. He wanted them to understand that witnessing such evil created an obligation to prevent its recurrence. And he wanted them to understand that the line between duty and humanity was not a boundary but a relationship, that duty without humanity enabled atrocity, but humanity without duty accomplished nothing. The liberation of Buchenwald represented a moment when American military forces confronted the full moral necessity of the war they had been fighting. Soldiers trained for combat found themselves responsible for humanitarian crisis beyond their training or emotional preparation. They responded with competence, compassion, and commitment to maintaining the distinction between victors and their defeated enemy. They did not save everyone. They could not undo what had been done. But they bore witness, provided what help remained possible, and ensured that evidence survived for judgment and historical memory. In the decades after World War II, debate emerged about whether Allied forces should have known sooner about concentration camps, whether they should have prioritized their liberation, whether more could have been done. These debates remain important for understanding Allied strategy and moral responsibility. But for soldiers like Marcus Holloway who arrived at Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, the relevant question was simpler. What do you do when military duty places you at the intersection of systematic evil and human suffering, when the rules you were trained to follow seem inadequate to the moral situation you face? Holloway's answer, shared by thousands of soldiers who liberated camps across Germany in spring 1945, was to maintain the discipline and legal structure that distinguished democratic nations from fascist regimes, while extending maximum possible humanity within that structure. They did not execute SS guards, though many wanted to. They documented atrocities, though doing so felt voyeuristic. They provided medical care and food, though knowing it came too late for thousands. They did what duty required while preserving what humanity demanded. This balance between duty and humanity defined the Allied response to concentration camp liberation and helped establish precedent for how democratic military forces should respond to systematic atrocity. It was imperfect. It could not address the scale of loss. But it represented a choice to maintain moral structure even when confronting evil that seemed to exceed moral framework. The lessons remained relevant across subsequent decades as American forces encountered humanitarian crises in Korea, Vietnam, and conflicts beyond. The fundamental question persisted: how do soldiers trained for combat respond to human suffering that exists outside combat parameters? The answer developed at Buchenwald and similar camps suggested that bearing witness was itself a form of duty, that providing help within available means was obligatory, and that maintaining legal and moral structure mattered precisely when confronting situations that seemed to render structure meaningless. If this account moved you, consider subscribing to this channel. We work to preserve these difficult stories because they contain lessons that remain necessary. History cannot be fully understood through victory narratives alone. It requires confronting the moments when soldiers faced choices that transcended military training, when the line between duty and humanity had to be walked without clear guidance, when ordinary people responded to extraordinary evil and tried to maintain their own humanity in the process. Thank you for listening, and for remembering.